Right now, World War II feels like distant history to most people encountering it today, reduced to dates, maps, and broad strategic overviews in most educational contexts. But for the tens of millions of ordinary people who actually served as soldiers during this truly global conflict, the actual lived experience involved a considerably more complex, more deeply human reality worth exploring with appropriate care and historical seriousness. Let's dig into this properly, drawing on the extensive historical record, including soldiers' own letters, diaries, and post war testimonies, to understand what this experience actually involved for the ordinary individuals who lived through it. Let's start with the sheer diversity of actual soldier experience, because this represents an essential starting point worth establishing clearly up front. World War II involved tens of millions of soldiers serving across dramatically different roles, geographic theaters, and specific circumstances, meaning there's no single, uniform soldier experience that could possibly capture this war's actual complexity. A soldier serving in North Africa's desert campaigns experienced dramatically different daily conditions compared to a soldier fighting in the Pacific Theater's island combat, or a soldier serving on the Eastern Front's brutal, sustained conflict, meaning any honest exploration of this topic requires acknowledging this considerable underlying diversity rather than presenting a single, oversimplified composite picture. Let's talk about basic training and the transition from civilian to military life, because this represents an important starting point shared, at least in general outline, across most soldiers' actual wartime experience. Millions of ordinary civilians, frequently quite young men, sometimes barely out of adolescence, underwent often compressed, intensive military training specifically designed to prepare them for combat within a considerably shorter time frame compared to peacetime military training standards, reflecting the war's urgent, sustained need for large numbers of trained soldiers. This transition frequently involved genuine psychological and physical adjustment, moving from ordinary civilian daily life into military discipline, physical training, and the initial preparation for what most soldiers understood would likely involve genuine combat and serious personal danger. Let's talk about the actual experience of combat itself, because this represents perhaps the most historically significant and most difficult to fully convey dimension of this broader topic worth exploring with appropriate care. Soldiers' own accounts consistently describe combat as involving intense fear, confusion, and sensory overwhelm, frequently quite different from the more orderly, comprehensible depiction popular media sometimes presents. Historical accounts describe combat involving prolonged periods of tense waiting and anticipation, interspersed with sudden, often chaotic, and disorienting periods of intense danger, reflecting the genuine psychological difficulty of sustained exposure to serious, unpredictable mortal danger that historical soldiers' own testimony consistently emphasizes and describes. Let's talk about the physical conditions many soldiers actually endured too, because this represents an important, often underemphasized dimension worth exploring specifically. Beyond combat itself, many soldiers endured seriously difficult physical conditions, including extended periods of inadequate shelter, difficult weather conditions ranging from extreme cold to extreme heat depending on the specific geographic theater, and frequently inconsistent access to adequate food, clean water, and basic sanitation. Soldiers serving in certain specific theaters, including notably the Eastern Front and various Pacific Island campaigns, faced particularly severe environmental conditions compounding the already significant danger and stress associated with combat itself. Let's talk about the psychological toll this experience took on soldiers too, because this represents an essential, historically significant dimension worth exploring with appropriate care and seriousness. Sustained exposure to combat, danger, and the loss of fellow soldiers produced significant psychological effects for many soldiers. What contemporary understanding recognizes as combat-related psychological trauma, though the specific terminology and level of institutional recognition and support available for this particular experience differed considerably from contemporary understanding and treatment approaches. Many soldiers' letters and post-war accounts describe genuine, lasting psychological difficulty processing their wartime experience, reflecting the serious, sustained psychological demands this particular experience placed on the people who actually lived through it. Let's talk about camaraderie and social bonds among soldiers too, because this represents an important, frequently emphasized dimension worth exploring specifically. offering some balance to the difficult experiences already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Soldiers' own accounts consistently emphasize the genuine, significant social bonds that developed among the small groups of fellow soldiers they served alongside, frequently describing these particular relationships as among the most significant and meaningful of their entire lives, connected directly to the shared experience of mutual reliance and support under really difficult, dangerous circumstances. This detail is worth including because it represents a consistently documented, historically significant dimension of soldiers' actual lived experience, existing alongside rather than simply canceling out the genuine difficulty and danger already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Let's talk about communication with family and loved ones back home too, because this represents an important, closely related dimension worth exploring specifically. Letters represented soldiers' primary means of maintaining connection with family and loved ones throughout their wartime service, with millions of soldiers regularly writing home, frequently working within the added constraint of wartime censorship restrictions limiting exactly what specific information they could actually share regarding their location and circumstances. These surviving letters represent an invaluable historical resource, offering direct, first-hand insight into soldiers' actual thoughts, concerns, and experiences throughout this war, considerably more direct and personal than official military records or later historical summary alone could ever fully convey. Let's talk about food, rationing, and supply challenges soldiers actually faced too, because this represents an important, practically detailed dimension worth exploring specifically. Soldiers' access to adequate food and supplies varied dramatically depending on their specific military branch, geographic theater, and their particular country's broader logistical and industrial capability, with soldiers serving within extended supply lines or particularly difficult geographic terrain frequently experiencing genuine, sustained food scarcity and inadequate nutrition, connecting directly to broader historical patterns already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how difficult sustained access to reliable food and water has historically proven during extended military campaigns throughout human history more generally. Standard issue military rations, while providing basic caloric sustenance, frequently proved monotonous and nutritionally limited, with soldiers' letters and diaries frequently mentioning both genuine hunger during particularly difficult supply periods and considerable appreciation for any additional food, whether official supplementary rations or informal local food sources that occasionally became available. Let's talk about medical care and its actual historical limitations too, because this represents an important, historically significant dimension worth exploring specifically. While World War II saw meaningful medical advances compared to earlier historical conflicts, including improved battlefield surgical techniques and earlier antibiotic availability, wounded soldiers still frequently faced truly difficult circumstances, including delayed evacuation from active combat zones, limited immediate pain management, and considerable risk of infection. Given the medical technology and battlefield conditions actually available during this specific historical period. Military medical personnel, including field medics and battlefield surgeons, frequently worked under extraordinarily difficult, high-pressure circumstances, making rapid triage decisions regarding treatment priority amid ongoing combat danger and severely limited available medical resources and personnel. Let's talk about non-combat roles and their own distinct wartime experience too, because this represents an important, often underemphasized dimension worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Not every soldier served in direct combat roles, with the war's enormous logistical demands requiring millions of soldiers serving in supply, transportation, communication, administrative, and various other essential support roles, each carrying their own distinct daily experience and challenges, generally involving less direct combat exposure, but frequently still involving genuine danger, considerable physical hardship, and demanding working conditions given this conflict's enormous overall scale and sustained operational demands. This detail is worth including because it broadens the overall picture already established throughout this discussion, illustrating that soldier experience during this war actually encompassed a considerably wider range of specific roles and circumstances beyond direct combat alone. Let's talk about prisoners of war and their particularly difficult specific experience too, because this represents an important, historically significant category worth exploring specifically, given how directly it connects to some of this conflict's most historically documented hardship. Soldiers captured and held as prisoners of war faced circumstances varying dramatically depending on which specific country held them captive, with some prisoners experiencing relatively humane treatment consistent with international wartime conventions. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. While others, particularly prisoners held within certain specific historical contexts, faced seriously severe deprivation, forced labor, and considerable danger to their basic survival and well-being. This detail is worth including because it represents an essential, historically significant dimension of the broader soldier experience already explored throughout this topic, deserving direct, honest acknowledgement alongside the other specific experiences already discussed extensively throughout the rest of this discussion. Let's talk about how soldiers actually coped psychologically with their circumstances too, because this represents an important, closely related dimension worth exploring specifically. Beyond the camaraderie already discussed extensively throughout this topic, soldiers developed various additional coping strategies for managing their really difficult circumstances, including humor, religious faith for soldiers who held religious belief, continued correspondence with loved ones already discussed extensively throughout this topic, and simply focusing attention on immediate practical tasks and responsibilities rather than dwelling extensively on the broader danger and uncertainty their circumstances actually involved. These various coping strategies, documented extensively through soldiers' own surviving letters and later testimony, illustrate the genuine psychological resourcefulness many soldiers developed and relied upon throughout their wartime service. Let's talk about how soldiers' experience frequently continued affecting them well after the war's actual conclusion, too, because this represents an important, closely related dimension worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Many soldiers carried significant psychological and physical effects from their wartime service well into their subsequent civilian lives, with the specific institutional support and public understanding available for managing these lasting effects varying considerably, depending on the specific country and historical period involved, generally proving considerably more limited compared to the more developed institutional support and public understanding contemporary veterans typically receive today. Let's talk about how soldiers' actual demographic backgrounds varied considerably too, because this represents an important dimension worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Soldiers serving during World War II came from remarkably diverse backgrounds, different countries, different social classes, and different levels of prior military experience, with many soldiers representing ordinary civilians with no prior military background whatsoever, called into service through various national conscription systems that most participating countries implemented given this conflict's truly enormous total scale and personnel requirements. Let's talk about the age range and specific circumstances soldiers actually came from too, because this represents an important, closely related demographic detail worth exploring in additional depth. While many soldiers were relatively young men, various countries' conscription systems eventually drew in an increasingly wide age range as the war's demands continued growing, with some soldiers being quite young, occasionally younger than official minimum enlistment age through various forms of documented age misrepresentation, while others served at considerably older ages than typically associated with frontline military service, reflecting each specific country's particular wartime personnel needs and circumstances as this truly global, sustained conflict continued placing increasing demands on available military personnel across its extended multi-year duration. Let's talk about how gender specifically shaped different countries' approaches to military service during this conflict too, because this represents an important, historically significant dimension worth exploring specifically. While the overwhelming majority of frontline combat soldiers during this conflict were men, reflecting the broader social and military conventions of this particular historical period. Women served in various significant military and paramilitary capacities across different countries, including combat roles within certain specific national military forces, alongside various essential support, medical, and communication roles more broadly, representing an important dimension of this broader wartime story, deserving direct acknowledgement alongside the more extensively documented male combat soldier experience already explored throughout most of this discussion. Let's talk about how specific individual soldiers' documented personal accounts help illustrate this broader collective experience too, because this represents a valuable, concrete way of grounding this broader discussion in genuine individual human testimony. Historians and museums specializing in this historical period have worked extensively to collect, preserve, and share individual soldiers' personal letters, diaries, and recorded oral history testimony, recognizing that these specific individual accounts frequently convey this broader historical experience's genuine human dimension considerably more directly and more powerfully than aggregate historical statistics or broader strategic summary alone could ever fully achieve. This detail is worth appreciating because it reflects an important, broader methodological priority within contemporary historical scholarship regarding this period, centering genuine individual human experience and testimony as an essential complement to broader historical and strategic analysis. Let's talk about how post-war historical memory and commemoration of this experience has evolved considerably over subsequent decades too, because this represents an interesting, closely related dimension worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Public historical memory and commemoration of this conflict's soldier experience has evolved considerably across the many decades since the war's actual conclusion, with contemporary historical scholarship increasingly emphasizing the diverse, individually varied experience already explored extensively throughout this topic, compared to certain earlier, sometimes more simplified or selectively emphasized historical narratives that characterized some earlier periods of public historical memory and commemoration regarding this significant historical conflict. Let's talk about how oral history projects specifically continue capturing remaining firsthand soldier testimony today, too, because this represents an important, time-sensitive contemporary research priority worth exploring before this discussion concludes. Given how many decades have now passed since this conflict's actual conclusion, researchers and historical institutions have worked with real urgency to record remaining firsthand testimony from the dwindling number of soldiers who personally experienced this conflict directly, recognizing that this irreplaceable firsthand historical testimony will eventually become entirely unavailable for direct collection once the last remaining individuals who personally lived through this specific historical experience are no longer alive to share it directly. Let's talk about how researchers and historians actually study this extensive historical topic responsibly too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Responsible historical scholarship on this topic draws extensively on soldiers' own first-hand accounts, including letters, diaries, and post-war oral history interviews, working to properly center actual soldiers' genuine lived experience and perspective, rather than presenting this history purely through broader strategic or political summary disconnected from the actual human experience this conflict involved for the millions of ordinary individuals who actually served. Let's talk about how this experience differed considerably depending on which specific side and country a given soldier served too, because this represents an important, historically significant distinction worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Soldiers' specific experience varied considerably depending on their particular country's specific military resources, strategic circumstances, and broader wartime conditions, with soldiers serving within certain specific countries and military circumstances facing considerably more severe supply shortages, higher casualty rates, or more difficult overall conditions compared to soldiers serving within other specific national contexts and circumstances during this same broader global conflict. Let's talk briefly about how this historical preservation effort has become an increasingly international, collaborative undertaking too, because this represents a fitting, worthwhile final point before this discussion concludes. Museums, archives, and research institutions across numerous different countries that participated in this conflict have increasingly collaborated on preserving and sharing soldiers' historical testimony and documentation, recognizing that properly understanding this truly global conflict's actual human experience requires drawing on testimony and documentation from soldiers who served across all the different participating nations and military forces involved, rather than focusing narrowly on any single country's specific perspective and experience alone. This collaborative international preservation effort reflects growing recognition that this significant shared historical experience, however differently individual, soldiers actually lived through it depending on their specific country and circumstances already explored extensively throughout this discussion, ultimately represents a truly shared piece of global historical memory, deserving careful, collaborative preservation and understanding extending well beyond any single national historical narrative or perspective alone. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full picture of what it was actually like to be a soldier during World War II turns out to reveal an enormously varied, deeply human experience, involving genuine danger, difficulty, and psychological toll, alongside meaningful camaraderie and connection among the soldiers who shared these difficult circumstances together. This experience varied enormously depending on specific geographic theater, national context, and individual circumstances, meaning no single, simplified narrative could ever fully capture this war's actual complexity for the tens of millions of ordinary people who lived through it as actual serving soldiers. So the next time World War II soldiers come up in conversation, whether through historical documentaries, family stories, or educational contexts, it's worth appreciating that these were real, ordinary individuals experiencing genuine fear, hardship, and loss, alongside real human connection and resilience. Rather than simplified historical figures reduced purely to strategic or statistical significance within broader historical summary, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If understanding this significant historical experience properly requires engaging with this much individual human complexity and variation, what does that suggest about how carefully we should generally approach other major historical events? Recognizing that broad historical summary, however useful for understanding overall context, frequently obscures the genuine, individually varied human experience actually lived by the real people who experienced that particular historical moment firsthand.